Hello everyone. Today we're going to do something a little bit different, and instead of writing a video essay or doing a deep dive on a book or some passages, I'm just going to read to you. When I was very young, I had a lot of trouble sleeping, and at points in my life I had to listen to the same audiobook over and over again to fall asleep. Now, I love listening to audiobooks, and I love listening to things when I fall asleep. However, when I sleep, I don't want to miss anything of the story. So, to remedy this is going to be a little exploration of literature around a theme. I will repeat this probably around different themes, but this one is about rain. So, what I'm going to do is I've collected a whole bunch of passages from some famous authors, and I'm going to read them to you, and they all have to do with the authors describing some rain. So, sit down or lay down, close your eyes, and let's just listen to some great authors describe the rain. It was a very dark evening for summer. The clouds appeared inclined to thunder, and I said we had better all sit down. The approaching rain would be certain to bring him home without further trouble. However, Catherine would not be persuaded into tranquility. She kept wandering to and fro from the gate to the door, in a state of agitation which permitted no repose, and at length took up a permanent situation on one side of the wall, near the road, where, heedless of my expostulations and the growling thunder, and the great drops that began to splash around her, she remained, calling at intervals, and then listening, and then crying outright. She beat Hareton, or any child, at a good passionate fit of crying. About midnight, while we still sat up, the storm came rattling over the heights in full fury. There was a violent wind as well as thunder, and either one or the other split a tree off at the corner of the building. A huge bough fell across the roof and knocked down a portion of the east chimney stack, sending a clatter of stones and soot into the kitchen fire. We thought a bolt had fallen in the middle of us, and Joseph swung up to his knees, beseeching the Lord to remember the patriarchs Noah and Lot, and, as in former times, spare the righteous, though he smote the ungodly. I felt some sentiment that it must be a judgment on us also. The Jonah in my mind was Mr. Earnshaw, and I shook the handle of his den that I might ascertain if he were yet living. He replied audibly enough, in a fashion which made my companion vociferate, more clamorously than before, that a wide distinction might be drawn between saints like himself and sinners like his master. But the uproar passed away in 20 minutes, leaving us all unharmed, excepting Cathy, who got thoroughly drenched for her obstinacy in refusing to take shelter, and standing bonnetless and shawlless to catch as much water as she could with her hair and clothes. She came in and lay down on the settle, all soaked as she was, turning her face to the back, and putting her hands before it. Wuthering Heights, by Emily Bronte. Down the sable flood we glided. I thought of the Styx and of Charon, rowing some solitary soul to the land of shades. Amidst the strange scene, with a chilly wind blowing in my face and midnight clouds dropping rain above my head, with two rude rowers for companions whose insane oaths still tortured my ear, I asked myself if I was wretched or terrified. I was neither. Often in my life I have been far more so under comparatively safe circumstances. "How is this?" said I. "Methinks I am animated and alert instead of being depressed and apprehensive." I could not tell how it was. One evening, and I was not delirious, I was in my sane mind. I got up, I dressed myself, weak and shaking. The solitude and the stillness of the long dormitory could not be borne any longer. The ghastly white beds were turning into spectres. The coronal of each became a death's head, huge and sun-bleached. Dead dreams of an elder world and mightier race lay frozen in their wide, gaping eye-holes. That evening, more firmly than ever, fastened into my soul the conviction that fate was of stone and hope a false idol, blind, bloodless, and of a granite core. I felt, too, that the trial God had appointed me was gaining its climax, and must now be turned by my own hands, hot, feeble, trembling as they were. It rained, still, and blew, but with more clemency, I thought, than it had poured and raged all day. Twilight was falling, and I deemed its influence pitiful. From the lattice I saw coming night clouds, trailing low like banners, drooping. It seemed to me that at this hour there was affection and sorrow in heaven above for all pain suffered on earth beneath. The weight of my dreadful dream became alleviated, that insufferable thought of being no more loved, no more owned, half yielded to hope of the contrary. I was sure this hope would shine clear if I got out from under this house roof, which was crushing as the slab of a tomb, and went outside the city to a certain quiet hill, a long way distant in the fields. Covered with a cloak, I could not be delirious, for I had the sense and recollection to put on warm clothing. Forth I set. The bells of a church arrested me in passing. They seemed to call me in the salute, and I went in. Any solemn rite, any spectacle of sincere worship, any opening for appeal to God, was as welcome to me then as bread to one in extremity of want. I knelt down with others on the stone pavement. It was an old, solemn church, its pervading gloom not gilded but purpled by light shed through stained glass. If the storm had lulled a little at sunset, and made up now for lost time, strong and horizontal thundered the current of the wind from northwest to southeast. It brought rain like spray, and sometimes a sharp hail like shot. It was cold, and pierced me to the vitals. I bent my head to meet it, but it beat me back. My heart did not fail at all in this conflict. I only wished that I had wings, and could ascend the gale, spread, and repose my pinions on its strength, career in its course, sweep where it swept. While wishing this, I suddenly felt colder where before I was cold, and more powerless where before I was weak. I tried to reach the porch of a great building near, but the mass of frontage and the giant spire turned black and vanished from my eyes. Instead of sinking on the steps as I intended, I seemed to pitch headlong down an abyss. I remember no more. I anticipated that, whether this nun be flesh and blood, or something that remains when blood is dried and flesh is wasted, her business is as much with you as with me, probably. Well, I mean to make it out. It has baffled me so far, but I mean to follow up the mystery. Instead of telling me what he meant, he raised his head suddenly. I made the same movement in the same instant. We both looked to one point, the high tree shadowing the great Berceau, and resting some of its boughs on the roof of the first class. There had been a strange and inexplicable sound from that quarter, as if the arms of that tree had swayed of their own motion, and its weight of foliage had rushed and crushed against the massive trunk. Yes, there scarce stirred a breeze, and that heavy tree was convulsed, whilst the feathery shrubs stood still. For some minutes amongst the wood and leafage a rending and heaving went on. Dark as it was, it seemed to me that something more solid than either night shadow or branch shadow blackened out of the boles. At last the struggles ceased. What birth succeeded this travail? What dryad was born of these throes? We watched fixedly. A sudden bell rang in the house, the prayer bell. Instantly into our alley there came, out of the Berceau, an apparition, all black and white, with a sort of angry rush close past our faces, swept swiftly the very nun herself. Never had I seen her so clearly. She looked tall of stature and fierce of gesture. As she went, the wind rose sobbing, the rain pouring wild and cold. The whole night seemed to feel her. I fear a high wind because the storm demands that exertion of strength and the use of action I always yield with pain. But the sullen downfall, the thick snow descent, or dark rush of rain, ask only resignation, the quiet abandonment of garments and person to be drenched. In return, it sweeps a great capital clean before you. It makes you a quiet path through broad, grand streets. It petrifies a living city as if by eastern enchantment. It transforms a Villette into a Tadmor. Let then the rains fall, and the floods descend. Down washed the rain. Deep lowered the welkin. The clouds, ruddy a while ago, had now, through all their blackness, turned deadly pale, as if in terror. Notwithstanding my late boast about not fearing a shower, I hardly liked to go out under this waterspout. Then the gleams of lightning were very fierce. The thunder crashed very near. This storm had gathered immediately above Villette. It seemed to have burst at the zenith. It rushed down prone. The forked, slanting bolts pierced the thwart vertical torrents. Red zigzags interlaced a descent blanched as white metal, and all broke from a sky heavily black in its swollen abundance. This evening, there was no bright sunset. West and east were one cloud. No summer night mist, blue yet rose-tinged, softened the distance. A clammy fog from the marshes crept gray around Villette. Tonight, the watering pot might rest in its niche by the well. The small rain had been drizzling all the afternoon, and still it fell fast and quietly. This was no weather for rambling in the wet alleys under the dripping trees, and I started to hear Sylvie's sudden bark in the garden, her bark of welcome. Villette by Charlotte Bronte. One evening I went into the back drawing-room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. Through one of the broken panes I heard the rain impinge upon the earth, the fine incessant needles of water playing in the sodden beds. Some distant lamp or lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and, feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, "O love, O love," many times. At last, she spoke to me. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. She asked me was I going to Araby. I forgot whether I answered yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar, she said. She would love to go. "And why can't you?" I asked. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet around and round her wrist. She could not go, she said, because there would be a retreat that week in her convent. Her brother and 2 other boys were fighting for their caps, and I was alone at the railings. She held one of the spikes, bowing her head towards me. The light from the lamp opposite our door caught the white curve of her neck, lit up her hair that rested there, and, falling, lit up the hand upon the railing. It fell over one side of her dress and caught the white border of a petticoat, just visible as she stood at ease. "It's well for you," she said. "If I go," I said, "I'll bring you something." Araby by James Joyce. It was now 5 o'clock, and the dawn was promising to break in hues of drab and ash. The air changed its temperature and stirred itself more vigorously. Cool, elastic breezes coursed in transparent eddies around Oak's face. The wind shifted yet a point or two, and blew stronger. In 10 minutes, every wind of heaven seemed to be roaming at large. Some of the thatching on the wheat stacks was now whirled fantastically aloft, and had to be replaced and weighted with some rails that lay near at hand. This done, Oak slaved away again at the barley. A huge drop of rain smote his face. The wind snarled round every corner. The trees rocked to the bases of their trunks, and the twigs clashed in strife. Driving in spars at any point and on any system, inch by inch he covered more and more safely from ruin this distracting impersonation of 700 pounds. The rain came on in earnest, and Oak soon felt the water to be tracking cold and clammy routes down his back. Ultimately, he was reduced well nigh to a homogeneous sop, and a decoction of his person trickled down and stood in a pool at the foot of the ladder. The rain stretched obliquely through the dull atmosphere in liquid spines, unbroken in continuity between their beginnings in the clouds and their points in him. Oak suddenly remembered that 8 months before this time he had been fighting against fire in the same spot as desperately as he was fighting against water now, and for a futile love of the same woman. As for her... But Oak was generous and true, and dismissed his reflections. It was about 7 o'clock in the dark leaden morning when Gabriel came down from the last stack and thankfully exclaimed, "It is done." He was drenched, weary, and sad, and yet not so sad as drenched and weary, for he was cheered by a sense of success in a good cause. Faint sounds came from the barn, and he looked that way. Figures came singly and in pairs through the doors, all walking awkwardly and abashed, save the foremost, who wore a red jacket, and advanced with his hands in his pockets, whistling. The others shambled after with a conscience-stricken air. The whole procession was not unlike Flaxman's group of suitors, tottering on towards the infernal regions under the conduct of Mercury. The gnarled shapes passed into the village, Troy, their leader, entering the farmhouse. Not a single one of them had turned his face to the ricks, or apparently bestowed one thought upon their condition. Soon Oak too went homeward, by a different route from theirs. Troy deposited his basket beside the tomb, and vanished for a few minutes. When he returned, he carried a spade and a lantern, the light of which he directed for a few moments upon the tomb whilst he read the inscription. He hung his lantern on the lowest bough of the yew tree, and took from his basket flower roots of several varieties. There were bundles of snowdrop, hyacinth, and crocus bulbs, violets, and double daisies, which were to bloom in early spring, and of carnations, pink, picotes, lilies of the valley, forget-me-not, summer's farewell, meadow saffron, and others, for the later seasons of the year. Troy laid these out upon the grass, and with an impassive face set to work to plant them. The snowdrops were arranged in a line on the outside of the coping, the remainder within the enclosure of the grave. The crocuses and hyacinths were to grow in rows. Some of the summer flowers he placed over her head and feet, the lilies and forget-me-nots over her heart. The remainder were dispersed in the spaces between these. Troy, in his prostration at this time, had no perception that in the futility of these romantic doings, dictated by a remorseful reaction from previous indifference, there was any element of absurdity. Deriving his idiosyncrasies from both sides of the channel, he showed at such junctures as the present the inelasticity of the Englishman, mingled with that blindness to the line where sentiment verges on mawkishness, characteristic of the French. It was a cloudy, muggy, and very dark night, and the rays from Troy's lantern spread into the two old yews with a strange illuminating power, flickering, as it seemed, up to the black ceiling of cloud above. He felt a large drop of rain upon the back of his hand, and presently one came and entered the open side of the lantern, whereupon the candle sputtered and went out. Troy was weary, and it being now not far from midnight, and the rain threatening to increase, he resolved to leave the finishing touches of his labor until the day should break. He groped along the wall and over the graves in the dark, till he found himself round at the south side. Here he entered the porch and, reclining upon the bench within, fell asleep. Troy slept on in the porch, and the rain increased outside. Presently the gargoyle spat. In due time a small stream began to trickle through the 70-foot of aerial space between its mouth and the ground, which the water drops smote like duckshot in their accelerated velocity. The stream thickened in substance and increased in power, gradually spouting further and yet further from the side of the tower. When the rain fell in a steady and ceaseless torrent, the stream dashed downward in volumes. We follow its course to the ground at this point of time. The base of the liquid parabola has come forward from the wall, has advanced over the plinth moldings, over a heap of stones, over the marble border, into the midst of Fanny Robin's grave. The force of the stream had, until very lately, been received upon some loose stones spread thereabout, which had acted as a shield to the soil under the onset. These during the summer had been cleared from the ground, and there was now nothing to resist the downfall but the bare earth. For several years the stream had not spouted so far from the tower as it was doing on this night, and such a contingency had been overlooked. Sometimes this obscure corner received no inhabitant for the space of 2 or 3 years, and then it was usually by a pauper, a poacher, or a sinner of undignified sins. The persistent torrent from the gargoyle's jaws directed all its vengeance into the grave. The rich tawny mold was stirred into motion and boiled like chocolate. The water accumulated and washed deeper down, and the roar of the pool thus formed spread into the night, as the head and chief among other noises of the kind created by the deluging rain. The flowers, so carefully planted by Fanny's repentant lover, began to move and writhe in their bed. The winter violets turned slowly upside down and became a mere mat of mud. Soon the snowdrop and other bulbs danced in the boiling mass like ingredients in a cauldron. Plants of the tufted species were loosened, rose to the surface, and floated off. Troy did not awake from his comfortless sleep till it was broad day, not having been in bed Not having been in bed for 2 nights, his shoulders felt stiff, his feet tender, and his head heavy. He remembered his position, arose, shivered, took the spade, and again went out. Bathsheba did not sleep very heavily that night when her attendant was unconscious and softly breathing in the next room. The mistress of the house was still looking out of the window at the faint gleam spreading from among the trees, not in a steady shine, but blinking like a revolving coast light, though this appearance failed to suggest to her that a person was passing and repassing in front of it. Bathsheba sat here till it began to rain, and the light vanished, when she withdrew to lie restlessly in her bed and reenact in a worn mind the lurid scene of yesternight. Almost before the first faint sign of dawn appeared, she arose again and opened the window to obtain a full breathing of the new morning air, the panes being now wet with trembling tears left by the night rain, each one rounded with a pale luster, caught from primrose-hued slashes through a cloud low down in the awakening sky. From the trees came the sound of steady dripping upon the drifted leaves under them, and from the direction of the church she could hear another noise, peculiar, and not intermittent like the rest, the purl of water falling into a pool. Far from the Madding Crowd, by Thomas Hardy. If it had not rained in the night between the 17th and 18th of June, 1815, the fate of Europe would have been different. A few drops of water, more or less, decided the downfall of Napoleon. All that Providence required in order to make Waterloo the end of Austerlitz was a little more rain, and a cloud traversing the sky out of season sufficed to make a world crumble. The Battle of Waterloo could not be begun until 11:30 o'clock, and that gave Blücher time to come up. Why? Because the ground was wet. The artillery had to wait until it became a little firmer before they could maneuver. Napoleon was an artillery officer, and felt the effect of this. The foundation of this wonderful captain was the man who, in the report of the Directory on Aboukir, said, "Such a one of our balls killed 6 men." All his plans of battle were arranged for projectiles. The key to his victory was to make the artillery converge on one point. He treated the strategy of the hostile general like a citadel, and made a breach in it. He overwhelmed the weak point with grape shot. He joined and dissolved battles with cannon. There was something of the sharpshooter in his genius. To beat in squares, to pulverize regiments, to break lines, to crush and disperse masses. For him, everything lay in this, to strike, strike, strike incessantly. And he entrusted this task to the cannonball. A redoubtable method, and one with a redoubtable message, and one which, united with genius, rendered this gloomy athlete of the pugilism of war invincible for the space of 15 years. On the 18th of June, 1815, he relied all the more on his artillery, because he had numbers on his side. Wellington had only 159 mouths of fire. Napoleon had 240. Suppose the soil dry, and the artillery capable of moving, the action would have begun at 6 o'clock in the morning. The battle would have been won and ended at 2 o'clock, 3 hours before the change of fortune in favor of the Prussians. What amount of blame attaches to Napoleon for the loss of this battle? Is the shipwreck due to the pilot? It had rained all night. The earth had been cut up by the downpour. The water had accumulated here and there in the hollows of the plain as if in casks. At some points the gear of the artillery carriages was buried up to the axles. The circingles of the horses were dripping with liquid mud. If the wheat and rye trampled down by this cohort of transports on the march had not filled in the ruts and strewn a litter beneath the wheels, all movement, particularly in the valleys, in the directions of the Papelet, would have been impossible. He conversed expansively. He regained the animation which he had shown at his landing on the 1st of March, when he pointed out to the Grand Marshal the enthusiastic peasant of the Gulf Juan, and cried, "Well, Bertrand, here's a reinforcement already." On the night of the 17th to the 18th of June, he rallied Wellington. "That Englishman needs a lesson," said Napoleon. The rain redoubled in violence. The thunder rolled while the emperor was speaking. On the 18th of June, 1815, the rains had still farther increased this acclivity. The mud complicated the problem of the ascent, and the men not only slipped back, but stuck fast in the mire. Along the crest of the plateau ran a sort of trench whose presence it was impossible for the distant observer to divine. On the day of battle, this hollow road whose existence was in no way indicated, bordering the crest of Mont Saint-Jean, a trench at the summit of the escarpment, a rut concealed in the soil, was invisible, that is to say, terrible. They ascended, grave, threatening, imperturbable. In the intervals between the musketry and the artillery, their colossal trampling was audible. Being two divisions, there were two columns of them. Wathier's division held the right. Delort's division was on the left. It seemed as though two immense adders of steel were to be seen crawling towards the crest of the tableland. It traversed the battle like a prodigy. Nothing like it had been seen since the taking of the great redoubt of the Moskowa by the heavy cavalry. Murat was lacking here, but Ney was again present. It seemed as though that mass had become a monster, and it had but one soul. Each column undulated and swelled like the ring of a polyp. They could be seen through a vast cloud of smoke which was rent here and there, a confusion of helmets, of cries, of sabers, a storm heaving of the cruppers of horses amid the cannons and the flourish of trumpets, a terrible and disciplined tumult. Over all, the cuirasses like the scales of a hydra. All at once, a tragic incident. On the English left, on our right, the head of the column of cuirassiers reared up with a frightful clamor. On arriving at the culminating point of the crest, ungovernable, utterly given over to the fury and their course of extermination of the squares and cannon, the cuirassiers had just caught sight of a trench between them and the English. It was the hollow road of Ohain. It was a terrible moment. The ravine was there, unexpected, yawning, directly under the horses' feet, 2 fathoms deep between its double slopes. The second file pushed the first into it, and the third pushed on the second. The horses reared and fell backward, landed on their haunches, slid down, all 4 feet in the air, crushing and overwhelming the riders. And there being no means of retreat, the whole column being no longer anything more than a projectile, the force which had been acquired to crush the English crushed the French. The inexorable ravine could only yield when filled. Horses and riders rolled there pell-mell, grinding each other, forming but one mass of flesh in this gulf. When this trench was full of living men, the rest marched over them and passed on. Almost a third of Dubois' brigade fell into that abyss. This began the loss of the battle. The men massed upon the drays allowed themselves to be jolted along in silence. They were livid with the chill of morning. They were all linen trousers, and their bare feet were thrust into wooden shoes. The rest of their costume was a fantasy of wretchedness. Their accoutrements were horribly incongruous. Nothing is more funereal than the harlequin in rags. Battered felt hats, tarpaulin caps, hideous woolen nightcaps, and, side by side with a short blouse, a black coat broken at the elbow. Many wore women's headgear, others had baskets on their heads. Hairy breasts were visible, and through the rent in their garments tattooed designs could be descried. Temples of love, flaming hearts, cupids. Eruptions and unhealthy red blotches could also be seen. 2 or 3 had a straw rope attached to the crossbar of the dray, and suspended under them like a stirrup, which supported their feet. One of them held in his hand and raised to his mouth something which had the appearance of a black stone, and which he seemed to be gnawing. It was bread which he was eating. There were no eyes there which were not either dry, dulled, or flaming with an evil light. The escort troop cursed. The men in chains did not utter a syllable. From time to time the sound of a blow became audible as the cudgels descended on shoulder blades or skulls. Some of these men were yawning. Their rags were terrible. Their feet hung down, their shoulders oscillated, their heads clashed together, their fetters clanked, their eyes glared ferociously, their fists clenched or fell open inertly like the hands of corpses. In the rear of the convoy ran a band of children, screaming with laughter. This file of vehicles, whatever its nature was mournful. It was evident that tomorrow, that an hour hence, a pouring rain might descend, that it might be followed by another, and that their dilapidated garments would be drenched, that once soaked, these men would not get dry again, that once chilled, they would not again get warm, that their linen trousers would be glued to their bones by the downpour, that the water would fill their shoes, that no lashes from the whips would be able to prevent their jaws from chattering, that the chain would continue to bind them by the neck, that their legs would continue to dangle, and it was impossible not to shudder at the sight of these human beings, thus bound and passive beneath the cold clouds of autumn, and delivered over to the rain, to the blast, to all the furies of the air, like trees and stones. Blows from the cudgel were not omitted even in the case of the sick men, who lay there knotted with ropes and motionless on the 7th wagon, and who appeared to have been tossed there like sacks, filled with misery. The storm increased in violence, and the heavy downpour beat upon the back of the Colossus amid claps of thunder. "You're taking in rain," said Gavroche. "It amuses me to hear the decanter run down the legs of the house. Winter is as stupid. It wastes its merchandise, it loses its labor, it can't wet us, and that makes it kick up a row, old water carrier that it is." This allusion to the thunder, all the consequences of which Gavroche, in his character of a philosopher of the 19th century, accepted, was followed by a broad flash of lightning, so dazzling that a hint of it entered the belly of the elephant through the crack. Almost at the same instant, the thunder rumbled with a great fury. The two little creatures uttered a shriek, and started up so eagerly that the network came near being displaced. But Gavroche turned his bold face to them, and took advantage of the clap of thunder to burst into a laugh. "Calm down, children. Don't topple over the edifice. That's fine. First-class thunder, all right? That's no slouch of a streak of lightning. Bravo for the good God. Deuce take it." That said, he restored order in the netting, pushed the two children gently down on the bed, pressed their knees in order to stretch them out at full length, and exclaimed, "Since the good God is lighting his candle, I can blow out mine. Now, babes, now, my young humans, you must shut your peepers. It's very bad not to sleep. It'll make you swallow the strain, or as they say in fashionable society, stink in the gullet. Wrap yourself up well in the hide. I'm going to put out the light. Are you ready?" "Yes," murmured the elder. "I'm all right. I seem to have feathers under my head." "People don't say head," said Gavroche. "They say nut." The two children nestled close to each other. Gavroche finished arranging them on the mat, drew the blanket up to their very eyes, then repeated for the third time his injunction in the heretical tongue. "Shut your peepers!" And he snuffed out his tiny light. Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. The dry goods stores were not down among the counting houses, banks, and wholesale ware rooms, where gentlemen most do congregate. But Jo found herself in that part of the city before she did a single errand, loitering along as if waiting for someone, examining engineering instruments in one window and samples of wool in another, with most unfeminine interest. Tumbling over barrels, being half smothered by descending bales, and hustled unceremoniously by busy men who looked as if they wondered how the deuce she got there. A drop of rain on her cheek recalled her thoughts from baffled hopes to ruined ribbons, for the drops continued to fall, and being a woman as well as a lover, she felt that, though it was too late to save her heart, she might her bonnet. Now, she remembered the little umbrella, which she had forgotten to take in her hurry to be off, but regret was unavailing, and nothing could be done but borrow one or submit to a drenching. She looked up at the lowering sky, down at the crimson bow already flecked with black, forward along the muddy street, then one long, lingering look behind, at a certain grimy warehouse with Hoffman, Swartz and Company over the door, and said to herself with a sternly reproachful air, "It serves me right. What business had I to put on all my best things and come philandering down here, hoping to see the professor? Jo, I'm ashamed of you. No, you shall not go there to borrow an umbrella, or find out where he is from his friends. You shall trudge away, and do your errands in the rain, and if you catch your death and ruin your bonnet, it's no more than you deserve. Now then." With that, she rushed across the street so impetuously that she narrowly escaped annihilation from a passing truck, and precipitated herself into the arms of a stately old gentleman who said, "I beg pardon, ma'am," and looked mortally offended. Somewhat daunted, Jo righted herself, spread her handkerchief over the devoted ribbons, and putting temptation behind her, hurried on, with increasing dampness about the ankles, and much clashing of umbrellas overhead. The fact that a somewhat dilapidated blue one remained stationary above the unprotected bonnet attracted her attention, and looking up, she saw Mr. Bear looking down. "I feel to know the strong-minded lady who goes so bravely under many horse noses, and so fast through much mud. What do you down here, my friend?" "I'm shopping." Mr. Bear smiled as he glanced from the pickle factory on one side to the wholesale hide and leather concern on the other, but he only said politely, "You have no umbrella. May I go also and take for you the bundles?" "Yes, thank you." Jo's cheeks were as red as her ribbon, and she wondered what he thought of her, but she didn't care, for in a minute she found herself walking away arm in arm with her professor, feeling as if the sun had suddenly burst out with uncommon brilliancy, that the world was all right again, and that one thoroughly happy woman was paddling through the wet that day. "Now, tell me what brought you, at last, just when I wanted you." "This," and Mr. Bear took a little worn paper out of his waistcoat pocket. Jo unfolded it and looked much abashed, for it was one of her own contributions to a paper that paid for poetry, which accounted for her sending it on occasional attempt. "How could that bring you?" she asked, wondering what he meant. "I found it by chance. I knew it by the names and the initials, and in it there was one little verse that seemed to call me. Read and find him. I'll see that you go not in the wet." In the garret. 4 little chests all in a row, dim with dust and worn by time, all fashioned and filled, long ago, by children now in their prime. 4 little keys hung side by side, with faded ribbons brave and gay, when fastened there with childish pride, long ago, on a rainy day. 4 little names, one on each lid, carved out by a boyish hand, and underneath there lieth hid histories of the happy band, once playing here and pausing oft to hear the sweet refrain that came and went on the roof aloft in the falling summer rain. Meg, on the first lid, smooth and fair, I look in with loving eyes, for folded here with well-known care a goodly gathering lies, the record of a peaceful life, gifts to gentle child and girl, a bridal gown, lines to a wife, a tiny shoe, a baby curl. No toys in this first chest remain, for all are carried away, in their old age to join again in another small Meg's play. Ah, happy mother, well I know you hear, like a sweet refrain, lullabies ever soft and low, in the falling summer rain. Jo, on the next lid, scratched and worn, and within a motley store of heedless dolls, of schoolbooks torn, birds and beasts that speak no more, spoils brought home from the fairy ground, only trod by youthful feet, dreams of a future never found, memories of a past still sweet. Half-writ poems, stories wild, April letters warm and cold, diaries of a willful child, hints of a woman early old, a woman in a lonely home, hearing like a sad refrain, "Be worthy, love, and love will come," in the falling summer rain. My Beth, the dust is always swept from the lid that bears your name, as if by loving eyes that wept, by careful hands that often came. Death canonized for us one saint, ever less human than divine, and still we lay with tender plaint, relics in this household shrine. The silver bell so seldom rung, the little cap which last she wore, the fair, dead Catherine that hung by angels born above her door, the songs she sang without lament in her prison house of pain, forever are they sweetly blent with the falling summer rain. Upon the last lid's polished field, legend now both fair and true, a gallant knight bears on his shield, Amy, in letters gold and blue. Within lie snoods that bound her hair, slippers that have danced their last, faded flowers laid by with care, fans whose airy toils are past. Gay valentines, all ardent flames, trifles that have borne their part, in girlish hopes and fears and shames, the record of a maiden heart. Now learning fairer, truer spells, hearing like a blithe refrain, the silver sound of bridal bells, in the falling summer rain. 4 little chests all in a row, dim with dust and worn by time, 4 women taught by weal and woe to love and labor in their prime. 4 sisters parted for an hour, none lost, one only gone before, made by love's immortal power nearest and dearest evermore. Oh, when these hidden stores of ours lie open to the Father's sight, May they be rich in golden hours, deeds that show fair the light. Lives whose brave music long shall ring, like a spirit-stirring strain, souls that shall gladly soar and sing in the long sunshine after rain. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. During all this blackness of the elements, Ahab, though assuming for the time the almost continual command of the drenched and dangerous deck, manifested the gloomiest reserve, and more seldom than ever addressed his mates. In tempestuous times like these, after everything above and aloft had been secured, nothing more can be done but passively to await the issue of the gale. Then captain and crew become practical fatalists. So, with his ivory leg inserted into its accustomed hole, and with one hand firmly grasping a shroud, Ahab, for hours and hours, would stand gazing dead to windward, while an occasional squall of sleet or snow would all but congeal his very eyelashes together. Meantime, the crew, driven from the forward part of the ship by the perilous seas that burstingly broke over its bows, stood in a line along the bulwarks in the waist, and the better to guard against the leaping waves, each man had slipped himself into a sort of bowline secured to the rail, in which he swung as in a loosened belt. Few or no words were spoken, and the silent ship, as if manned by painted sailors in wax, day after day, tore on through all the swift madness and gladness of the demoniac waves. By night, the same muteness of humanity before the shrieks of the ocean prevailed. Still in silence, the men swung in the bowlines. Still wordless, Ahab stood up to the blast. Even when wearied nature seemed demanding repose, he would not seek that repose in his hammock. Never could Starbuck forget the old man's aspect, when one night, going down into the cabin to mark how the barometer stood, he saw him with closed eyes, sitting straight in his floor-screwed chair, the rain and half-melted sleet of the storm from which he had some time before emerged, still slowly dripping from the unremoved hat and coat. On the table beside him lay an unrolled one of those charts of tides and currents which have previously been spoken of. His lantern swung from his tightly clenched hand. Though the body was erect, the head was thrown back so that the closed eyes were pointed towards the needle of the telltale that swung from a beam in the ceiling. Terrible old man, thought Starbuck with a shudder, sleeping in this gale, still thou steadfastly eyest thy purpose. The wind increased to a howl. The waves dashed their buckles together. The whole squall roared, forked, and crackled around us like a white fire upon the prairie, in which, unconsumed, we were burning, immortal in these jaws of death. In vain we hailed the other boats, as well roar to the live coals down the chimney of a flaming furnace as hail those boats in that storm. Meanwhile the driving scud, rack, and mists grew darker with the shadows of night. No sign of the ship could be seen. The rising sea forbade all attempts to bail out the boat. The oars were useless as propellers, performing now the office of life-preservers. So, cutting the lashing of the waterproof match keg, after many failures, Starbuck contrived to ignite the lamp in the lantern, then stretching it on a waif pole, handed it to Queequeg as the standard-bearer of this forlorn hope. There, then, he sat, holding up that imbecile candle in the heart of that almighty forlornness. There, then, he sat, the sign and symbol of a man without faith, hopelessly holding up hope in the midst of despair. Wet, drenched through, and shivering cold, despairing of ship or boat, we lifted up our eyes as the dawn came on. The mist still spread over the sea. The empty lantern lay crushed in the bottom of the boat. Suddenly, Queequeg started to his feet, hollowing his hand to his ear. We all heard a faint creaking, as of ropes and yards hitherto muffled by the storm. The sound came nearer and nearer. The thick mists were dimly parted by a huge, vague form. Affrighted, we all sprang into the sea as the ship at last loomed into view, bearing right down upon us within a distance of not much more than its length. Floating on the waves, we saw the abandoned boat, as for one instant it tossed and gaped beneath the ship's bows like a chip at the base of a cataract. And then the vast hull rolled over it, and it was seen no more till it came up weltering astern. Again we swam for it, were dashed against it by the seas, and were at last taken up and safely landed on board. Ere the squall came close to, the other boats had cut loose from their fish and returned to the ship in good time. The ship had given us up, but was still cruising, if haply it might light upon some token of our perishing, an oar or a lance pole. Warmest climes, but nurse the cruelest fangs. The tiger of Bengal crouches in spiced groves of ceaseless verdure. Skies the most effulgent, but basket the deadliest thunders. Gorgeous Cuban-nosed tornadoes that never swept tame northern lands. So, too, it is that in these resplendent Japanese seas, the mariner encounters the direst of all storms, the typhoon. It will sometimes burst from out that cloudless sky, like an exploding bomb upon a dazed and sleepy town. Towards evening of that day, the Pequod was torn of her canvas, and bare-poled was left to fight a typhoon which had struck her directly ahead. When darkness came on, sky and sea roared and split with the thunder, and blazed with the lightning, and showed the disabled masts fluttering here and there with the rags, which the first fury of the tempest had left for its after-sport. Holding by a shroud, Starbuck was standing on the quarter-deck, at every flash of the lightning glancing aloft to see what additional disaster might have befallen the intricate hamper there, while Stubb and Flask were directing the men in the higher hoisting and firmer lashing of the boats. But all their pains seemed not, though lifted to the very top of the cranes, the windward quarter boat, Ahab's, did not escape. A great rolling sea, dashing high against the reeling ship's high teetering side, stove in the boat's bottom at the stern, and left it again, all dripping through, like a sieve. Bad work, Mr. Starbuck," said Stubb, regarding the wreck. "But the sea will have its way. Stubb, for one, can't fight it. You see, Mr. Starbuck, a wave has such a great long start before it leaps. All round the world it runs, and then comes the spring. But as for me, all the start I have to meet it is just across the deck here. But never mind, it's all in fun, so the old song says." Moby Dick, or The Whale, by Herman Melville.